March 28th, 1980. 3,400 workers punched out of Wisconsin Steel that afternoon, same as they had for years, for decades, for generations. They drove home to their modest brick bungalows in South Deering, stopped at the local joints for a beer, kissed their wives, asked their kids about school. None of them knew they would never work another shift. By Monday morning, the mill gates were locked. Chase Manhattan Bank had frozen the company's accounts. And those final paychecks the folk had just deposited, they bounced. Every single one of them. No severance, no vacation pay, no pension, no health insurance, nothing. And here's the statistic that I still can't wrap my head around. Within 8 years of that closure, more than 800 of those 3,400 workers were dead. That's nearly 1 in 4. Heart attacks, alcoholism, stress-related illness, men who had spent their lives pouring molten steel, who had survived temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit, who had lost fingers to the machinery. These men did not survive losing their jobs. So how did this happen? How did one of Chicago's oldest steel mills go from economic heartbeat to mass grave in the span of a decade? The answer involves a company with $9 million buying a mill worth $250 million. It involves a deal so cynical that courts would later call it a fraudulent scheme. And it involves a cast of characters who walked away rich while the folk who built their wealth walked away with nothing. These stories tend to get buried. If you think it's important that people remember what happened to the workers of Wisconsin Steel, liking this video actually helps the algorithm share their story with a broader audience. Let's go back to the beginning. 1875. The Joseph H. Brown Iron and Steel Company opens on Chicago's far south side at 107th Street and Torrance Avenue. It would eventually become Wisconsin Steel Works, one of the first major industrial operations in the Calumet region. In 1902, the mill gets swallowed up by a giant. Deering Harvester merges with International Harvester, and IH acquires Wisconsin Steel. The purpose is simple: furnish steel for International Harvester's farm equipment. Tractors need steel, combines need steel, and IH wants to control every link in the chain. By 1910, International Harvester is grossing about $100 million in annual sales, more than 17,000 workers in the Chicago area. And Wisconsin Steel isn't just a mill, it's a satellite operation for a vertically integrated empire. IH owns the coal mines that fuel the furnaces, the iron mines that supply the ore, the railroad that moves the materials, even an ore-carrying vessel on the Great Lakes. This is how American industry worked in its golden age. You didn't just make things, you controlled everything that went into making things. Now, I need to explain what working in a steel mill actually meant for these communities. Because if you didn't grow up in a place like South Deering, you might not understand what was lost. The steel district of Chicago's southeast side, South Chicago, South Deering, east side. These weren't just neighborhoods, they were worlds unto themselves. Mill, church, bar, and home. An integrated industrial life where your father worked at the mill and his father before him, and your sons would follow after. The work was brutal. Men lost fingers. Men died in machinery accidents. The night sky glowed red from the pouring and transfer of molten iron. Security was tight. The mills were sealed from public view, these massive industrial fortresses that the surrounding communities depended on completely but could never really see inside. Starting salaries in the 1960s were nearly 3 times the minimum wage. In 1973, the United Steelworkers negotiated one of the most generous labor contracts in American history: pensions, health benefits, dignified middle-class wages for work that would destroy your body. There's a quote from Christine Wally, whose father Chuck worked at Wisconsin Steel for years. Her father once mused, "Yeah, we thought we were middle class there for a while. We were almost middle class." Almost. That word does a lot of work in this story. By the late 1970s, International Harvester had a problem. Well, several problems. Wisconsin Steel was old. The company had let the mill run down for 75 years. Equipment was years beyond its operating life. The blast furnaces were obsolete. But here's the real issue. The mill had approximately $86 million in unfunded pension liability. That's $86 million that IH owed to workers who had given their lives to that mill. International Harvester wanted out, but they couldn't just close the mill. That would mean paying those pensions, owning that obligation. So they found a buyer. And this is where the story gets, I want to say interesting, but the word I'm actually looking for is criminal. Envirodyne Industries. Founded in 1970 as a small environmental engineering company based in Los Angeles. CEO Ronald Lind. Net worth. When purchasing Wisconsin Steel, $9 million. Let me repeat that. A company worth $9 million was about to buy a mill worth $250 million. A company with net earnings of slightly more than $250,000 was about to take on a massive industrial operation with obsolete equipment and nearly $100 million in pension obligations. Envirodyne had zero experience in steelmaking. Zero. Other steel companies privately called this sale a cynical maneuver by Harvester to dodge its pension obligations. And they were right. But let me show you exactly how the scheme worked, because the mechanics are almost beautiful in their brazenness. The purchase price was $65 million. But Envirodyne discovered that Wisconsin Steel had about $40 million in iron ore, steel, and coal inventories just sitting there. So here's what Ronald Lind did. He convinced Chase Manhattan Bank to make a $50 million commodity loan against that inventory. So now he has $50 million in cash from the bank. Only $15 million went to International Harvester at closing. The remaining $50 million was to be paid over 10 years through 8.5% notes. And here's the kicker. IH was given rights to convert 10 million of those notes to Envirodyne stock. Plus, IH agreed to purchase about 30% of Wisconsin Steel's production. So International Harvester sold the mill, but they were still on the hook as buyers of the product. They still had skin in the game, supposedly. The remaining $35 million from the Chase loan was supposed to go toward capital improvements, modernizing the equipment, fixing the blast furnaces. The result? Envirodyne acquired a $250 million company with essentially no money of their own at risk. It's like, imagine if you wanted to buy a house, but instead of putting money down, you found hidden gold in the basement, used that gold as collateral for a loan, and then used that loan to pay for the house. Except the house is falling apart and you have no idea how to fix it. But wait, there's one more detail that makes this whole thing even more suspicious. The deal was structured so that Envirodyne would not go under if the steel mill failed. Wisconsin Steel was organized under a subsidiary called EDC Holding Company, a corporate firewall between Envirodyne and the disaster everyone should have seen coming. Ronald Lind moved Envirodyne's headquarters to Chicago. He announced a $50 million modernization program over 5 years. He forecasted $1 billion in revenues by the mid-1980s. We had high hopes of making a go out of the mill, he later claimed. High hopes. Sure. Here's what actually happened. The U.S. steel industry was already in a depression. Foreign competition from Japan was gutting American manufacturers. The equipment at Wisconsin Steel kept breaking down, reducing output to less than 75% capacity. Those breakdowns alone were costing the company $22 million per year. Unable to meet shipments, customers turned elsewhere. And here's where environmental regulations enter the story. New pollution control laws required $20 million or more in immediate improvements. That drained the capital that was supposed to go toward modernization. Envirodyne applied immediately for a $90 million loan, guarantee from the Economic Development Administration, a government program designed to stimulate employment in distressed areas. Despite being among the first to apply, Envirodyne struggled to meet the loan conditions. The loan never came through. And then the final blow. 1979, 1980, a strike at International Harvester. Okay. Remember, IH was still supposed to be buying 30% of Wisconsin Steel's production. They were the mill's best customer. The strike killed off the company's largest source of orders. The mill had been losing money for 3 straight years. Let me set the scene for you. It's early 1980. Jimmy Carter is in the White House, running for re-election against Ronald Reagan. Inflation is running at 18%. Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve is jacking up interest rates to fight that inflation. The prime rate would reach over 20% by year's end. The Iron Curtain is still up. Vietnam is a fresh wound. And the American economy is stumbling through what historians would later call the beginning of deindustrialization. Nobody has yet coined the term Rust Belt. That wouldn't happen until Walter Mondale's 1984 campaign, when he told steelworkers in Cleveland that Reagan's policies were turning our industrial Midwest into a Rust Bowl. The media changed it to Rust Belt, but in March of 1980, people still believed in American steel. They believed in the mills. They believed in the jobs. March 28th, 1980, Black Friday. Wisconsin Steel closed suddenly. No warning, no notice. 3,400 employees showed up to work and found themselves locked out immediately. Many workers weren't even allowed to empty their lockers. Chase Manhattan Bank had already frozen the accounts. The game was over. In April, Chase Manhattan notified workers that their final paychecks were worthless. The checks had bounced. Workers lost everything. Back pay, vacation pay, severance, pension benefits, health care. Everything they had worked for, everything they had been promised, gone. And here's something that reveals the collective anxiety, the mass delusion, the desperate hope of that moment. The shutdown was so sudden that many workers didn't even apply for unemployment benefits. They believed the mill would reopen. They waited. They used their savings. They scraped by on short-term income. The mill never reopened. The Progressive Steelworkers Union, the House Union at Wisconsin Steel, was supposed to help. That's what unions do. But the Progressive Steelworkers was mired in controversy. It was later revealed to be a political front for former Chicago Alderman Edward Verdoliak. When the workers needed their union most, the union failed them. Into this void stepped a man named Frank Lumpkin. I need to tell you about Frank Lumpkin, because in a story full of villains, corporate raiders, indifferent executives, complicit politicians, Frank Lumpkin is the moral center. He's the reason this story isn't just tragedy. Frank Lumpkin was born in 1916 in Washington, Georgia, into a family of sharecroppers. His family moved to Orlando, Florida, seeking work. They lived and worked on an orange grove. At age 15, Frank quit school to work full-time in the citrus plantations. He lost several fingers in a workplace accident as a teenager. He boxed professionally as a young man. In 1941, he moved to Buffalo, New York, got a job at Bethlehem Steel. In 1943, he joined the Merchant Marines, participated in a strike organized by the Integrated National Maritime Union. This was during World War II, when interracial organizing was both rare and dangerous. In 1949, he moved to Chicago, married Beatrice. In 1950, at age 34, he was hired at Wisconsin Steel. He would work there for more than 30 years. Frank Lumpkin was a member of the Communist Party USA. He was black. He was a union man. And when the mill closed in 1980, when the Progressive Steelworkers refused to fight, Frank Lumpkin stepped forward. He and his wife, Beatrice, co-founded the Wisconsin Steel Save Our Jobs Committee. It was a coalition of African American, Mexican American, and other steelworkers and their families. At first, they fought to reopen the mill. When that became impossible, they fought for back pay, pensions, health care, any scrap of what had been promised. They hired Chicago labor lawyer Thomas G. Oggigan. They picketed offices in Illinois and Washington, D.C. They ran programs for food, medical care, utility assistance. The Save Our Jobs Committee dinners and social gatherings became a lifeline, preventing the isolation that was killing so many former workers. Because people were dying. I mentioned that statistic earlier, but let me be more specific about what killed them. Suicide, alcoholism, substance abuse, stress-related illness, heart attacks, depression, lack of health care in a country that ties health care to employment. And for those who had worked the coke ovens, the most dangerous jobs, which had historically been assigned to African American workers due to systemic racism, work-related diseases claimed them years after the mill closed. The psychological impact was devastating. Isolation, depression, divorce. Many steelworkers' skills were not transferable to other industries. What do you do when you've spent your life making steel and suddenly there is no steel to make? Chuck Wally, the father of Christine Wally, who I mentioned earlier, he found intermittent work as a toll booth attendant, a janitor, a security guard. He never landed a better job. He remained bitter and depressed until his death in 2005. Yeah, we thought we were middle class there for a while. We were almost middle class. The Save Our Jobs Committee fought for 17 years. In 1988, they won a $14.8 million class action settlement against International Harvester, which by then had renamed itself Navistar. The maximum individual payment was a lump sum of $17,200 for workers who had lost pensions worth far more, for workers who had given their lives to that mill. By the time of that settlement, more than 1 in 6 former steelworkers had already died. In 1995, they won another settlement against Envirodyne. Workers received 900,000 shares of Envirodyne stock worth about $3 million total. Combined settlements, approximately $17 to $19 million, only about one-third of the $40 million owed. The courts found that the original sale was structured to avoid Wisconsin Steel's pension liabilities. Buyers, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, and workers alleged that International Harvester knew the buyers were doomed to fail, and the transaction was a sham. IH was accused of knowingly making false representations concerning the value of assets and earning potential. The legal documents called it a fraudulent scheme by Harvester, its board of directors, and one of its senior vice presidents to unload an unprofitable operation and defeat the claims of creditors. A fraudulent scheme. Those are court words, not mine. Now let me tell you what happened to the villains in this story, because this is the part that makes the anxiety rise in my chest every time I think about it. Envirodyne. Remember, the deal was structured so they couldn't lose. Wisconsin Steel filed for bankruptcy on March 28, 1980, but Envirodyne itself did not go under. The corporate firewall worked exactly as intended. They got out of the steel business entirely and pivoted to food packaging. In 1983, they bought Clear Shield, Inc., disposable flatware, drinking straws. In 1986, they bought Viscase Corporation for $250 million. And Envirodyne's stock became, and I'm quoting here, one of the most incredible stocks on Wall Street. It doubled in price. In 1989, CEO Ronald Lind sold the company and walked away with $40 per share. His personal profit, approximately $75 million. $75 million. For the man who bought a mill he couldn't run, let it collapse, walked away from the workers he'd promised to save, and then built a new fortune while those workers died. When asked about Wisconsin Steel, Envirodyne said, "I don't look on Wisconsin Steel as a skeleton in our closet because we feel we did everything we could to keep it open." International Harvester. By the early 1980s, they were losing huge amounts of money, veered near bankruptcy themselves. They renamed themselves Navistar International Corporation, sold the farm equipment business, and the International Harvester named Tenneco, Inc. By the end of the 1990s, Navistar was headquartered in suburban Warrenville, the nation's leading manufacturer of large trucks. A successful company with a new name, the old sins filed away in some corporate archive. And what about the community? What about the land? The Wisconsin Steel site remains an undeveloped brownfield to this day. Chemically contaminated land extends for miles. The buildings were demolished around 1984, 1985. Today, it's an industrial wasteland between residential neighborhoods. Housing prices in southeast Chicago dropped 9% immediately after the closure. The regional housing bubble eventually popped entirely. Today, median home prices in those neighborhoods range from $80,000 to $100,000, less than one-third of Chicago's median of $330,000. Many families stayed despite the economic collapse. They were too invested to leave, too rooted, too poor to go anywhere else. The modest brick bungalows still line the streets of South Deering. The local joints have closed. The churches have emptied. The mills are gone, and what remains is the land they poisoned. Frank Lumpkin fought until the end. Mayor Harold Washington appointed him to governmental task forces on the steel industry and dislocated workers. Washington once said of him, "When I see you, I know things are in good hands." Frank played an important role in the elections of Harold Washington, Charles Hayes, and Carol Moseley Braun. His wife Beatrice wrote his biography called Always Bring a Crowd, the story of Frank Lumpkin, steelworker, published in 1999. Frank Lumpkin died in March 2010, at age 93, fighting until the end. Christine Wally, whose father lost everything when Wisconsin Steel closed, is now an associate professor of anthropology at MIT. She wrote a book called Exit Zero, Family and Class in Post-Industrial Chicago. She collaborated on a film called Exit Zero, An Industrial Family Story. She's working with the Southeast Chicago Historical Society on a collective history project. The Frank and Beatrice Lumpkin papers are held at the Chicago History Museum. Someone is preserving the story. Someone is making sure we remember. Wisconsin Steel was the first of many mills to close in the Calumet region. U.S. Steel South Works closed in 1992, ACME Interlake in 2001, LTV Steel Republic Steel in 2002. Between 1980 and 2014, 7 million industrial jobs were lost in the United States. The communities built around those jobs, the folk who worked those mills, who raised their families on those wages, who believed in the promise of middle-class stability, they were left holding nothing but contaminated land and broken promises. There's a lesson here about corporate America, about what happens when the people making decisions are insulated from the consequences of those decisions. International Harvester's executives didn't live in South Deering. Ronald Lind didn't lose his fingers in a steel mill at age 15. The folk who bore the cost of deindustrialization were never the folk who made the decisions that caused it. The loot went one direction. The suffering went another. I think about that phrase a lot. We were almost middle class. Because that almost isn't just about money. It's about dignity. It's about the belief that if you work hard, if you show up every day, if you give your body to the machinery, you will be taken care of. You will be respected. You will matter. Wisconsin Steel broke that promise. Not through bad luck or changing markets or forces beyond anyone's control, through a scheme, through a cynical decision by executives who knew exactly what they were doing and structured the deal so they would never have to answer for it. More than 800 workers dead within 8 years of the closure. And the man who bought the mill for nothing walked away with $75 million. There's a word for that. Several words, actually. But maybe the most accurate is the one the courts used. Fraud. The land remains contaminated. The community's never fully recovered. But the story survives, and maybe that's the only justice we get. The story survives. Every Rust Belt town, every mining community, every industrial hub has a Wisconsin Steel, a place that was the heartbeat of the city until it wasn't. If your town has a story like this, a factory that closed and left a ghost behind, I want to read about it. Leave a comment below with the name of the place. I might cover it in a future video. And if you want to see that video, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.